A little bit smaller crowd today. Just that. Though Mimi is here online. Hi, Mimi.
Hi, Mimi.
A little bit smaller crowd today because we have folks traveling for Thanksgiving, but we are going to record, so that will work out. Just one programming note. I am going to flip the topics for the last 2 weeks in December. So the next 3 weeks we'll do resurgence. Then we'll do universities and monasteries, and then we'll do controversies and crusades. So those will be flipped. You can, the problem with this section, the readings kind of triple up and they kind of overlap a lot. So we're just gonna handle it in a slightly different order. I knew when I did this in late July that there'd be some alterations I'd want to make here and there, but let's handle that out of order as far as the schedule is concerned. We'll get new schedule in the bulletin. I just made that decision yesterday, so y'all are the first ones to hear about that. But today we'll be spending, actually in December, we'll be spending 3 weeks on the High Middle Ages, which is kind of 1000 to 1300, give or take. A lot going on then, but there are also some periods of church history when not as much goes on, and that's where we are today. We're talking about the so-called Dark Ages. That's really not the preferred term anymore. That was a term that they coined in the Renaissance because they wanted to show how enlightened they were, and so by contrast, they talked about the dark times before. Most scholars now talk about the early medieval period, the early Middle Ages, then the High Middle Ages in the middle, and then the late Middle Ages, which is encompassing the Renaissance too. But we are going to talk about this period here. And the readings this week focus really kind of on 3 countries, especially France, Germany, and then on England/Britain. And so we'll look at those in that 400-year period. And since our DNA comes from Britain, we'll spend just a little more time on British stuff here today. All right, so Dark Ages, really medieval, early Middle Ages is what we're talking about. So kind of from the fall of Rome to the turn of the millennium is that era. And so for 600 to 1000, that kind of overlaps with this period. Now, there is stuff going on. There is learning that happens. The ball does move forward. Yardage is gained, just not quite at the heavy speed of events that happened centuries earlier or centuries that follow. So maybe the slow ages might be better than the dark ages. The pace of change gears down a little bit during this time, but early medieval time. So we left Western Christianity in 600 with kind of this map. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, which will later be the heart of Eastern Orthodoxy, we'll talk about that. They are kind of stable at the end of 600, and Western Europe, the western half of the Roman Empire, is just this fragmented patchwork of all kinds of stuff that's splintered into all these little kinglets and fiefdoms, and fiefdoms a little bit early, retrojecting that word, but all these little tiny countries. As somebody said, we don't have kings, we have kinglets, we have warlords, we have we got strong men. They do have kingdoms, but they're not the big overarching things anymore. And during this period, we've got pressure that comes into Western Christianity from a couple different directions, from the northeast and from the southeast. We've got Islam coming up out of Arabia, and we've got the Vikings after that coming in from Scandinavia. And both of those will actually have an impact on Christianity and the history of Christianity. So I want to spend just a moment with them. We'll talk more about Islam later on with the Crusades as well, but let's talk about Islam momentarily. Islam, we may not think about it this way, but in the world religions, there are really 2 missionary religions that really go out and try to make converts: Christianity and Islam. And Islam shares some DNA with Christianity and with Judaism. We all look to Abraham as our founder. Muhammad, whom the Muslims regard as the final prophet, had great respect for the Christians and for the Jews. The Quran mentions the importance of Jesus as a prophet, of Moses as a prophet. the importance of the Gospels, the importance of the Torah, the Jewish law. Now, it will also stipulate that the Christians don't have the pure copy of the gospel. That's in heaven, and we've got an adulterated copy. And the Jews don't really have the pure copy of the Torah. That also is in heaven, and it's it's a flawed copy that we have here on earth. But the Quran is the perfect copy because it was dictated to Muhammad, and he recited it back in turn. So there's great respect in some ways for these other Abrahamic religions, and really. I don't want to get myself in trouble, but the Prophet Muhammad, in some ways, looked to Christians and looked to Jews and really did not like the polytheism of his fellow Arabs and really wished that things would change. And so for him to have the revelations he said he had goes right along with his desires to have a monotheistic religion for the Arab peoples. So we are tied together in that way. And the other piece, we are a missionary religion just like they are. The two largest religions in the world by adherence are Christianity first, and then Islam, a close second. So about 2.4 billion Christians, about 1.9 billion Muslims in the world right now. And currently the fastest growing, well, there's another religion, it's not missionary, so to speak, but it is the fastest growing religion worldwide. And also, especially in our country, it is no religion. That is making huge gains in the 21st century. They are now in third place. They've got a ways to go to catch up with Islam and Christianity. And if you put Islam and Christianity combined, they've got a ways to go catch up to us there. But they outnumber Hindus now. They outnumber Buddhists 2 to 1. And one of the things that we often don't recognize, even though Islam and Christianity both stem from Judaism, Judaism has never been about going out and making lots of converts. If you show up and want to convert, in fact, the rabbi said, we're supposed to push you back. And if you come back, we're supposed to push you back again. If you come back a third time, then we'll let you convert. We want to make sure you're serious about it. But if you build it, they will come. We're not going to go out and look for converts. They need to come to us. So really, if you look on the list of world religions, Judaism is almost a footnote, way down towards the bottom of this list. There are actually some smaller religions after that, but as a percentage of the world's religious population, it is not large in the least. But it's hugely influential because it did spawn the two biggest religions, Christianity and Islam. I mean, there are more Sikhs in the world, and nobody thinks of Sikhism as a major world religion. And yet Judaism, we do think that way, mainly because it had two very successful children, or daughter organizations, the daughter faith that sprung from it. So that's going to also mean, because Christianity and Islam are both looking at making converts, at times they're going to butt heads. They would butt heads in the 700s. They butt heads in the 2100s. In Africa right now, there is this. That's where the clash often happens geographically, as Islam and Christianity bump up against each other. There are more Muslims now in the United States than there are Episcopalians. They passed us, a while back in the U.S. So missionary religion. So Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, born somewhere around 570-ish, died in the year 632. He said he had his first visions around age 40, so somewhere around 610-ish. And then he went public with those visions a few years later, 613. And we won't go into great depths of the history of Islam, but just looking at this map of expansion here, it's hard to see. But if you look at the dark orange, that's the first 10 years of the Islamic world's expansion from 620 to 630, basically. The yellow is the next 30 years, 630 to 660 roughly. And then the green is the next 90 years. So you can see there's a rapid expansion early on, and it slows down a little bit, but it keeps expanding quite a ways, goes all the way into Afghanistan in the east and across North Africa and up into Spain. So we're talking, you remember North Africa was a Christian region, Augustine of Hippo, was from North Africa. Remember Egypt was the center of Christianity early on. Remember certainly the Holy Land, Jerusalem, Antioch. This area is certainly a Christian cradle. It was a heavy Christian land. So Islam is sweeping through these historic Christian lands and sweeping up into Europe. And actually, the Islamic expansion has actually stopped in Europe at a place called Tours, which we talked about as a center of monasticism in France. There's a battle of Tours, and they stopped Muslim expansion, and the Muslims said, "Okay, we'll go back to Spain and kind of be good south of the Pyrenees here, and we'll stop there." So it is an expansive religion, and that will come into play in future centuries as well. We will not be done with Islam after the Dark Ages by any stretch of the imagination. Any questions so far?
Why did they stop?
There was a battle at
The Battle of Tours really did, yeah. Charlemagne's grandfather, yeah.
They just stopped.
Yeah, they just, there's a great scene in the movie Silverado. John Cleese is playing the sheriff, and they're chasing the good guys, the heroes who are trying to break their buddy out of jail, Kevin Costner. And, they've got Danny Glover up on the hill, who's a sharpshooter with a rifle. And John Cleese stops, and all of a sudden gets his hat shut off. He looks, the bush next to him has the twig broken off by the shots from the rifle. His deputy says, "He's not hitting anything, you fool. He's hitting everything he's aiming for." Well, your jurisdiction is over there. They're still in your jurisdiction. He says, "Today, my jurisdiction ends here." And they turn around. So that's kind of Islam. We go this far, and okay, we're going to settle in. And they'll settle into Spain for 7th century. That's a big part of the history of Spain is Islamic overlay, and we'll say more about that later. Jimmy knows lots about that topic as well. So, okay, as Jimmy said, the Battle of Tours, Charles the Hammer or Charles Martel. We have lawyers that have nicknames, but they had kings that had nicknames. So, and there's a hammer, the Texas Hammer in Dallas, attorney. Charles the Hammer stopped that expansion in 732 in France. And as we said, Spain was still under Muslim rule for basically 7 centuries, more or less. It would ebb and flow the amount of Spain they controlled. And interestingly, we don't have a lot of time for this, but the Jewish/Christian/Muslim relationship in Spain is actually fascinating. The three faiths got along actually fairly well, except during those times when they were trying to regain territory or anything. During peacetime, Christians and Jews were treated well by Muslims. Early on, when Christians took things back over, Muslims and Jews were treated very well. Later, we'd have something called the Spanish Inquisition, and things fell apart. But Spain actually, for centuries, was a model of some coexistence for these three faiths. In fact, Jimmy's been here, I have not. But the Church of Cordoba is one of Jimmy's favorites. So there was a church there, and then they built over it and turned it into a mosque. And then when they got the area Christian again, they decided to build a church, and they just actually built it smack dab in the middle of the mosque. So, I mean, you can see it's a nice Gothic structure rising up out of the mosque here. And inside, Jimmy also had pictures of this on slideshows he did. It looks like a mosque, except when you step out of the mosque into the church they built. So, these faiths just overlapping each other. Was that a pagan temple first before it became a church?
I think that one was just a facade.
That was just a church first.
Yeah.
Church, then mosque, then church. There are some places where it was pagan temple, then church, then mosque, then church. But this is fascinating, just to not tear it down, but and not to remodel the whole thing, but say, okay, they've got this much, we don't need this much space. We'll just slap a church in the center of the building.
But because they did that, that is the only mosque from that period from Spain still around.
Because they didn't
Because
remodel
they
it or
they just
knock it
put the
down.
church right in the middle. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So that's the only one
That's
that's
the only one,
extant.
yeah.
Interesting.
They know
Interesting.
that other cathedrals were built on top, but that's the only one left.
Interesting.
Is it used as a mosque at all?
No, the Catholic diocese, a couple of people tried to use it as a mosque and they kicked them out pretty quick.
Okay.
Because
Okay.
it's Catholic property.
So the Roman Catholics control it and
That's it.
not letting it coexist. speaking of Jimmy's travels, this is apropos of nothing, but Jimmy was also in Guatemala a couple of years ago on a mission trip, and they have Mayan worship that goes on the lower steps of the Roman Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was built on a Mayan temple, and they won't let them do anything Mayan, but in the church, but they do let them do a couple grain type sacrifices on the lower steps of the front of the church. So sometimes you make allowances, sometimes you don't. Okay, so we got this pressure coming from, across North Africa into Spain from one direction. And then just basically about the time Islam slowed down, we get these dudes from the Northeast, the Vikings, from the Scandinavian regions. When I was a kid, there's that movie, The Vikings, with Kirk Douglas, but there's another movie with Richard Widmark, what is that called? And Sidney Poitier, The Long Ships. And it shows Vikings interacting with Muslims. And I thought, this is the stupidest thing. Vikings live up here, Muslims are down here. What the heck are they showing? Well, the Vikings actually did. They interacted with all kinds of cultures. This is the Viking home area here in green, and they made some inroads into England and Ireland and Scotland, but mainly Scandinavia. But the blue lines represent all of their voyages and all their trading things that they did. I mean, they got around, and they certainly bumped heads with and got down into Muslim areas. And so that Hollywood movie, which I later found out was based on a Scandinavian novel, so it was a Viking descendant that wrote it anyway. Actually, there's some truth in that. Maybe not the plot of that movie, but giant golden bell they're looking for. But the Vikings were all over the place. I mean, all the way into what we call Russia, all the way down North Africa, Sicily, and then across in North America too. So I mean, for having fairly small ships, they were able to get a long ways, and because their ships were small, they were able to go up rivers that you couldn't take deeper keeled ships into. Gordon, you were going.
Yeah, so these folks weren't Christians.
No, not they will be, but
Yeah, but at the time, they're just nothing.
they are pagan. And I mean, Norse religions, Thor, Odin, that kind of thing. And there are some neo-Norse pagans out there. The hammer of Thor is a symbol that some people wear in their jewelry. Not the comic book hero Thor, but a different symbol. There's still groups that claim to be following these Scandinavian religions. So actually that anticipates the next slide, Gordon. So they will become Christianized after 1000. There'll start to be missionaries and Christianization happening. But before that, they're pagan. We also think of the Vikings just as raiders, but they're just as much settlers as they are raiders. They do expand by putting settlements down, especially in Britain and Ireland and things. So it's not just in northern France. So they are settling as well as raiding over these three centuries here. And you can see some of those enclaves there, Normandy and anyway. All right, but what really kind of started the Viking Age as far as the church is concerned was in 793. The Vikings appeared out of nowhere and attacked a monastery in Scotland on the island of Lindisfarne. And it completely surprised the monks, because Christian churches were off limits to raiders. Everybody knows that. Everybody agrees on that. Well, the Vikings didn't. The Vikings didn't give a flip about that. And they just hauled into these defenseless monasteries where they stored jewels, where they had some gold, where they had other things, and some food supplies and things. And so the Vikings thought they were just low-hanging fruit. Yeah, that's these fat chickens just waiting to be plucked. They're leaving it undefended. Well, it's a gift to us. And so monasteries became a favorite target. Monasteries would have to fortify themselves, build walls, do some things later that they didn't do then. But that first attack at Lindisfarne, in fact, here's a contemporary these days painting. You got the poor monk trying to hold the processional cross, and the Viking is coming at him with an axe, and some peasants trying to come at the Viking with a pitchfork or something. But it was a slaughter basically, and the Vikings got lots of loot. Writing about that, Alcuin of York, who is a historian and saint, says about that attack, never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we now have suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, the church, like dung in the streets. They had no respect. They should have, but they didn't. They're terrible, horrible people. There is a apocryphal prayer that sometimes I see gets cited. There's no citation for it, but you sometimes hear this, that there was a litany from the fury of the Northmen, good Lord, deliver us. But there are real versions out there. It's not that, but this one, O supreme and holy grace, protecting us and ours, deliver us, God, from the savage race of Northmen, which lays waste our realm. So it may not have been that prayer which you hear quoted all the time, but apparently Christians were praying for protection against the Norsemen. Norsemen. All right, so pressures from Islam, pressures from Scandinavia. And again, Scandinavia, they will send missionaries up there in the early thousands. And they'll become a pretty solidly Christian area later, but not at this point. All right. Let's switch gears a little bit. Our book talked a lot about things in France and Germany. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on these. France was a place where Christianity was strongly rooted during this period and even before. Germany was kind of a missionary territory. It started to be converted during this period of the early Middle Ages. Remember, France, we talked about monasteries being up here in France and being centers of monasticism. Last week, we talked about St. Martin of Tours, that same place where the battle would be fought later. Part of that monastery at Tours, founding monastic communities in France. So France is a heavy center of Christianity. In fact, the book has this map. All the little crosses here represent bishops' offices, bishops' dioceses. And if you look, here's the Rhine River. You got a lot in France, you got some in England, you got a bunch in Italy, not so much on the other side of the Rhine. So in 600, here is the empty territory that missionaries can expand into. But France is very much a center of Christianity, even at the early stages of the Dark Ages. And so is Spain, though when Islam comes up, not so much so. And North Africa, we talked about St. Augustine in North Africa, heavy Christian place, but not after the Muslims come through. Right. There were some people, your book talks about waves of Celtic missionaries that go into France and to help strengthen the church even. And they made converts, but it was kind of like preaching crusades almost, going in and revving things up and not making permanent changes. There were some other saints that tried to do things a little more structurally. One who intended to strengthen the church in France came from England to France, Britain to France, St. Boniface, but then turned left. After coming to France, he decided he was going to go to Germany. And he is the one he's kind of the St. Patrick of Germany, the one who is credited as being the first great missionary to Germany. And there's a wonderful story about St. Boniface. You can't imagine in our culture anybody doing this with religious pluralism and all this. But St. Boniface went to a sacred oak tree, a pagan, Nordic, again, we're talking Thor and Odin and all these kinds of religious overlays in Germany, sacred oak tree, and whipped out an axe and started hacking. And it was a big tree, and he kept hacking and hacking. And the people were all waiting and said, oh, he's going to get it. The gods are going to send lightning down, and he's going to get it. So let's just stand back, stand out of the way, and watch the fire show. The gods will show this guy with an axe what happens when you mess with our sacred tree. So they didn't intervene because they were expecting the gods to do it. Well, while he's chopping, a huge wind arises and helps topple the oak. And so they go, oh, okay. Maybe our gods aren't powerful. Maybe this guy's God is powerful. And so it's one of those stories whether there's a lot of truth or anything to it, it got around, and it's one of those legendary things that helps, explain some of the conversion of Germany. So the famous Saint Boniface with the axe. You cannot imagine a missionary doing that today. But in the Dark Ages, in the early Middle Ages, okay, that's how they rolled. All right. We talked about Charles Martel stopping things in France, and Jimmy mentioned Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne. Charlemagne will be one of the central figures in Christianity. In the Dark Ages, if there's a Renaissance, it's around the reign of Charlemagne and around the person of Charlemagne, around his court. Charlemagne just means Charles the Great, Charles Magnus. And he's king of the French first, and then he becomes king of northern Italy. Oh, you can see a progression going here. And then he eventually becomes the emperor of the Romans. And this is one of those easy dates to remember. It's a nice round number, 800. Charlemagne gets crowned as the emperor of the Romans. And he's the first guy to get that title in 300 years. They've not had an emperor in the West. They've had emperors in Byzantium, in the Eastern Roman Empire, but in the West, he's the first. So well over 300 years. Later on, this entity that Charlemagne starts and that is French at first, then becomes German, will later be called the Holy Roman Empire, which, as the joke goes, is not really holy, not really Roman, and not really an empire, but that's the name that gets applied to it retroactively. But they don't use that term with Charlemagne. It's retrojected on him later on. But that entity at some level will last for almost 1,000 years into the 19th century. Yeah.
I'm assuming he's a military man.
Yes.
That's why he's the emperor.
That's why. I mean, well, it'd be interesting. I guess some of the some of the decadent kings of France, maybe, later in the 1600s or 1700s, you could see people not being military leaders, but really, there's probably no way to rise to kingship, I would think, in these early, apart from, and if you did, you wouldn't be king for long. You get, plus you have, the king dies and leaves an infant son. Well, what happens? Well, they try to protect the son, they try to, and oftentimes those kids get wiped out. Or they have very strong protectors who call the shots. So you've got to have some power behind the throne here. The importance to Christianity, though, not just to French and European politics, is there is something called the Carolingian Renaissance. Carol is Latin for Charles, and so anytime you see Carolingian, that applies to a Charles. Jacobian, Jacob, is the Latin for James. And so we'll have Jacobian things in England later, and we have Carolinian and Carolingian things. Just means Charles. So one of the things he did was within his realm, which was France and into northern Italy, saying we need to kind of get on the same page as far as what our church services look like. And they did, and they standardized things all across that huge swath of territory. Clergy were really getting stupid at this point. Clergy did not go to seminary. There were some smart clergy that would be in centers of learning, but the average priest out in the average parish might not even speak Latin. They might be able to recite Latin just by rote, but
And by memory, not by.
and by memory, not by reading it. Jimmy also points out. And so they're trying to crank that up a little bit. Also, clerical celibacy is not yet the rule here, but it's kind of a sort of an expectation a little bit. But priests have concubines all over the place, and so they're trying to clean that up a little bit. Yeah, everybody knows that the priest's housekeeper is also the woman he shares a bed with. Okay, so they're trying to clean that up. That'll be an issue all the way through the Middle Ages and even later. When you have clerical celibacy, you often have adaptations that happen, compromises that get made. So anyway, so that's happening here. Also trying to clean up monasteries. Monasteries, as we'll see in the High Middle Ages too, there's this wonderful pattern of monasteries and monastic things arise to purify and to make things holy, and then they kind of get corrupted and lazy, and then another group comes and tries to crank things up, and they get corrupted, and this is happening, and Charles is already trying to push back on some of that. Charlemagne is trying to push back on some of that, and to say we need to, if you're going to be a monk, let's behave like a monk, and let's these are some boundaries you should observe here. One of the most lasting things, he also said it's really hard to read monk's handwriting. So it's not just him, it's his advisors. So he invented something called Carolingian Miniscule, which, by golly, is something that looks like cursive writing. I mean, it really does. For 1,200 years now, that's been cursive, more or less. This is later, but in the late Middle Ages, they will come up with a Gothic script. When you look at old medieval stuff, that's what you think of as really medieval, with all the little curly cues on it and everything. And in the Renaissance, they said, we need to get back to the old Roman way of doing things. They mistook the Roman way of writing as Carolingian Miniscule. So Carolingian stuff really held on for 1,200 years as cursive writing, basically. So that was important to kind of standardize and to be able to share documents and copy documents, etc. All right. Also, it's not just Charles doing this. He had, as a spiritual advisor, a guy named Saint Alcuin. We talked about him quoting about Lindisfarne. He's from York, Northern England, and yet he's a monk, a British monk, and yet he's in France, and he is the power behind the throne spiritually, whispering in Charlemagne's ear, suggesting things, and kind of pushing these changes. So a lot of Charlemagne's changes stem back to Saint Alcuin. All right. So interestingly, the British send Saint Boniface to France, and he goes to Germany. They send Alcuin to France, and he is huge in Charlemagne's court. So there's kind of a cosmopolitan thing here. We think of these countries as about kind of being divided up and separate, but there's a flow here of some people and some
Where did
ideas.
Charlemagne have his residence? Where did he reign from?
That's a good question. I think it was southern France, wasn't it?
Southern France.
It probably shifted too as he took Lombardy, northern Italy, and got Rome. I'll show you a map of the whole kingdom in just a second here. So there was a period after Charlemagne's time when things kind of held for a while with his descendants. And then in the early 900s, things kind of fell apart for about 60 years until a German came in named Otto and kind of got things reorganized. And he kind of took over as Holy Roman Emperor. And so the Holy Roman Empire kind of shifted from France as its locus to Germany at this point. So just to look at a couple of maps here, where are we? Here we are. So Charlemagne's time is the orange on the left. So, kind of extending down into northern Italy, down into Rome. Otto's version doesn't include France so much. It's more Germany, and it pushes further east, but it also extends down to Rome and a little bit further down the Italian peninsula as well. So what does that say about Rome? We haven't talked really about Rome much at this point. Rome was kind of left out to dry when the Byzantines left it behind. So if Rome is calling the French king the Roman emperor because he controls Rome, and if they're calling the German king the Roman emperor because he controls Rome, then they're Roman, not because Rome is in control, they're Roman because they're controlling Rome. So this says volumes about Rome's power during this entire period. Rome is still a pilgrimage center. The Pope is still living there. We'll have a mess a little bit later on when the Pope starts living in southern France, and when there are multiple popes, but that's a little ways ahead of us here. But the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, is Roman just because it has Rome as a piece on its chessboard, not because Rome is calling the shots by any means. Now, the popes and the Roman Church are going to kind of push back on things, try to exert more authority. In the High Middle Ages, they'll actually reach their apex of political authority. And the Pope does crown Charlemagne as Roman Emperor. So there is some give and take here. And Charlemagne and later guys certainly want the Pope to be on their side, the bishops in their realm to be on their side. But the bishops are not calling the shots at this point. Huon is an important advisor and things like that. All right, any questions or things here?
Yeah, I guess I have one.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm tracking, how much of calling these regions like France and Germany is us like retro?
We're retrojecting. I mean, really the Frankish kingdom is that Charlemagne was king of the Franks.
Mhm.
And modern France, let's go back here. I mean, we've got later on the 100 Years' War, England's got control tons of in fact, Normandy was British for a long, long time. And, there's always that stuff going on too. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, which is over here, was the Queen of England. So later, we kind of retroject those titles just because it's easier on the map to picture France. But
Yeah, he's like Germany, I was under the impression it really wasn't
it's
any sort of.
late 19th century. In Italy, the same way. Italy is it's a peninsula, but it's not really a nation state until late 1800s. So yeah, I'm using those terms geographically more than politically. So thanks. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about Christianity in Britain. And because the Episcopal Church does trace our DNA to the Church of England, that's important to us. Now, I'm actually going to backtrack just a tad. We haven't talked about the legendary beginnings of the church in England. The legend is, and this gets tied up with King Arthur legends, that Joseph of Arimathea and the Holy Grail and the Gospel were all brought to England, maybe to a place called Glastonbury, which figures hugely in Arthurian mythology, by Joseph of Arimathea, whom there's some suggestions was Jesus's uncle. Okay, well, Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in the Gospels. He's one of the guys that buries Jesus. And he and Nicodemus are part of the Sanhedrin in John's Gospel, and they bury Jesus together. And wealthy, apparently. And that's all we know biblically. So anything more is later legend and accretion and speculation and a good story. But we know there was a Joseph of Arimathea, but was he Jesus's uncle? Yeah. Did he go to England? Yeah. They take, this is a later legend, they take Jesus with them when Jesus was a kid. The British actually love that legend. In fact, there's a very popular British hymn that nobody else sings because it's so British, but you hear it in the movie Chariots of Fire. In fact, it's where Chariots of Fire gets its name. Even Monty Python sings the song. We have the tune in our hymnal, but not the words. Poem by William Blake. And those feet refer to Jesus. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? Was Jesus walking here on our hills? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did his holy face, his countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here amongst these dark satanic mills? He doesn't like the Industrial Revolution. And so did we have a glimmer of God's land here when Jesus was here before we built all these cruddy factories? And then it goes on from there. Bringing my chariot of fire. And we'll rebuild Jerusalem. We'll make England a new Jerusalem again. So, it's nothing biblical about that. Nothing really historical about it. It's pure speculation and legend. And even William Blake is not saying Jesus did walk here. He's asking, did Jesus walk here? So even he's staying one step away from it. But it's a popular story in England. Popular thought that Jesus was here. George Washington slept here all up and down the East Coast, and Jesus was here according to those legends. All right. Okay, fact. Probably in the late 1st century, maybe in the 2nd century, the gospel was somehow brought to England. There seems to be evidence of a church maybe as early as the 1st century, but definitely in the 2nd century, because by the 3rd century, by 208, Tertullian mentions Christians being in England. Tertullian, the writer, talks about those English Christians. And St. Alban was famously martyred during the Emperor Diocletian's time, 304. And in a council in Arles in France, they recorded 3 British bishops. So the church in England and Britain is organized enough that there are 3 bishops to attend a council. Also, 3 British bishops are listed as attending a later council, and it's noted that the emperor offers basically scholarships to any diocese that's too poor to send anybody, and only the British take him up on the offer. So that says kind of volumes. Everybody else is afraid of getting under the thumb of the emperor, perhaps by taking his money. But it also suggests that the British church is not heavily resourced, that they are a poorer group monetarily. So that's the 300s. In the 400s, we know that Rome pulls back from Britain. We've talked about this a little bit before. And so for a couple of centuries, there's no Roman overlay in Britain. It's kind of independent. Britain being across a little narrow body of water, that gives it some separation at times from the rest of the continent. We talked a week or two ago about St. Patrick, son of a British deacon, going to Ireland, also being trained in France, and then coming back to be a missionary in Ireland. So that's happening in Britain during this period of no Roman presence. St. Columba, Irish monk, went to Scotland. That's happening during this same time of no Roman presence. And then we've also talked that the Roman presence reasserts itself when Pope Gregory sends St. Augustine of Canterbury in the late 500s, early 600s to convert Britain, and is surprised to find Christians right where he lands. So with that, we've got kind of a problem. So from 410 to 605-ish, the church in Britain had been forgotten, really forgotten. That its existence was kind of not known by the Pope in Rome. It's just so off the radar screen, but they were doing just fine. Thank you very much. They didn't need, they weren't missing the Pope's attention in any way, shape, or form, doing just fine. But now the Pope has a bishop, an archbishop in Canterbury, southwest England, and things get a little tense in Britain during the 600s. So the words that are often used is the Celtic Christians and the Roman Christians. So the Celtic Christians, the native British Christian, Patrick being a Celtic Christian, the independent British church before the Romans came back, then this Roman overlay, the church that answers to the bishop in Rome, at least somewhat, to some degree. And what didn't help is that the Pope said, okay, my guy in Canterbury has authority over the entire church in all the islands. That's the man in charge. All you British bishops who have been independent for a couple centuries, answer to him now. So that rankled them quite a bit, rankled the British bishops. Also, they had some bizarre little slight disagreements about when to calculate the date for Easter. Okay, there's a Celtic way, and we don't want to get in the minutia. Also, their monks cut their hair different. If you remember, your picture of a typical monk has a shaved spot, a bald spot shaved into his head. The Celtic monks shaved all their head except kind of the front or the top. And so it's almost the reverse haircut. So a Celtic monk looks exactly the opposite of a Roman monk. Hair and no hair versus hair and no hair. So these are the important questions you have to wrestle with here. Really, it's about authority, who calls the shots, but you have these things also. So there's a famous meeting that happens in Northern England. They get all the players together in a town called Whitby, have a little synod. That's not the church that was there then. That's later ruins of a monastery in Whitby, but it's an important center of Christianity there. And the Celtic Christians said, okay, well, Peter died in Rome. Paul died in Rome. It's no big deal if we can flip our haircut. I mean, who really cares about haircuts? If they want to calculate Easter this way, and if the rest of Europe is going along with it, fine. So basically what happened at Whitby is the Celtic Christians said, okay, we'll go along with Roman authority, with Roman customs, and we'll be part of the bigger family in Gaul, France, Spain, all that at this time. We'll play ball, we'll play nicely with others. All right, but one thing to note is that there is that period in the DNA and in the memory of the British Church that says, for 200 or 250 until we exceeded Whitby, we really were doing just fine on our own. That'll come up later in the English Reformation. Do we really need to listen? If the Pope in Rome is going too far, do we need to listen to him anymore? And so we'll talk about that in the spring when we get to the Protestant Reformation and into the English Reformation. It's kind of like Texans. There was a time when we were a country. We were a horrible country. We couldn't support ourselves. We were unsustainable, but we had to glom onto the United States because for 9 years we couldn't do things. But we were a country. We were an independent country. We love that. Well, the British Church kind of had that in their memory too. We were an independent church. All right, real quick. Don't mention when we talk about Brits, we were also talking about Boniface and Alcuin as great British monks that did things on the continent. Also, there's one more important Brit I want to mention during this time, Saint Bede. He was Alcuin's grand teacher, teacher's teacher. And Saint Bede wrote the great history of the English people. And in the English church, he was the one that tells us about St. Albans' martyrdom under Diocletian and all that. So he was an important figure, not just for English literature, but also for English Christianity. Just want to mention him by title. All right, so we're going to skip over the Orthodox stuff in the book. I'll pick that up later in January. For the next 3 sessions, focusing on the High Middle Ages. And as I said, I'm going to flip the topics. The original order was on the 12th, we're going to do controversies, and on the 19th, we're going to do universities and monasteries. I'm going to flip those two. If you want to read all this sometime, it all kind of overlaps in different ways. So if you want to get some reading done early, great, or however you want to slice that. This was a long section originally because I had it happening during Christmas break when people have a little extra time. But then when I realized I miscalculated the calendar and had an extra week, it shifted forward. But anyway, that's the game plan. Any questions here? Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to ask this, but during this whole period we're looking at, it looks like there's jockeying for who's going to be in charge. And what was going on actually teaching the people to be Christians instead of who's going to be in charge of that?
And that's a good question, because a lot of times, and this happens in secular and political history too, our minds tend to focus on leadership at the top instead of what's happening amongst the people on the ground level. And one of the newer things is, a lot of that is a lot of historians now are trying to focus on ground level, not just in church history, but secular history too. I have a friend who is a historian, and she specialized on these women's letters during the Civil War. What was it like to be a woman living in the Civil War in Ohio? Okay, that's different than what's happening with generals and armies and presidents and all that. So a short answer is the church is expanding because they are baptizing, they are teaching people about the faith, and that is going on this whole time and will continue to go on. And so it's a good reminder, David, that we need to remember that while all these big forces are happening up here, that the church is also surviving for the same reasons they expanded during the Roman Empire, because people are caring for each other, because people are coming to church, worshiping God, receiving the sacraments, doing all those things, getting taught the gospel, all those things. So all that is going on during this entire time period. But our eyes get drawn to the big movements, the big leaders very, very naturally. So that's a good question. Good question. And part of, go ahead, Jerry.
And you also still have the political and the church are working together. And so the political can kind of reinforce that you need to be doing some of that and living moral lives and everything for the good of society.
And churches are also centers of commerce later. They'll be important places in the economic life of towns. They'll often organize themselves around churches. That'll be in the Middle Ages. But also monasteries function to help people in the region area, to teach them, also to help them in other ways. So that stuff down in the lower levels is all going on during this period. It's just not what the focus is. Does that kind of answer your question?
Kind of, the upper levels then weren't really good examples of Christianity in a lot of instances.
Sometimes that is so true. Often, and that's not unique to that era at all. We have had ministers of various kinds with issues, and yet we forget that faithfulness goes on in the pews even when clergy are naughty. So, good question. Good question. All right. Well, we're a little over there, so we'll stop and pick up next time there.